Thank you for being here today. And Mandy and I thought this would be a good presentation for us to do at this time of the year, since this is an election season, as if you didn't know that because you're getting bombarded with campaign signs and ads and canvassers in your neighborhood. But we also are doing this kind of as a little appetizer to what our continuing ed will be focusing on next year, which is civic engagement. So this will hopefully whet your appetite for that. And I am going to turn off my video now because I personally find it a little distracting to have it on while I'm leading a class. And we'll go ahead and get started here. We have an agenda today, only as far as what we're going to do, not as far as what we're planning for you, hoping you'll do. But we're going to start out with defining what is civic engagement and why libraries are a really logical location to have civic engagement. And then we've kind of divided this into thirds. So the first third of our time together, we'll do the definition and talk about libraries. Then we'll move on to Mandy's section, which I know you're all eager to hear. She's always a wealth of information. So she's going to share about the legal aspects and some of those touchy topics and how you can do those in your library without too much worry. And then we'll do the last third where we'll share some practical examples, which I will say are kind of sprinkled throughout the entire presentation. I've got some resources to share with you, and then we will have ample time at the end for question and answer. I just want to briefly say that as I was preparing this webinar, I did a lot of preliminary research. I read articles, viewed webinars, even attended at least one live session on the topic. I was trying to learn more about it, and it suddenly dawned on me as I was gaining more information that, hey, in my library career, I've actually done some civic engagement opportunities without really realizing that's what I had done. So today, not only do Mandy and I hope to inform you about the topic of civic engagement, including its meaning, its value, and its legalities, but we also hope to help you realize that this may not be something too far out of reach beyond what your library is already doing, and that maybe you just need to tweak a few of your services or programs, that you can easily modify what you have done or are currently doing to make it more of a community engagement process. So let's start out with this definition. Maybe you've heard civic engagement. It's been a phrase that's popping up a lot in National Library land. I think it's very easy to start tossing around buzz phrases without really stopping to consider what they mean, and I don't want that to happen today. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when you hear civic engagement, or how would you define civic engagement? Let's say you go back to your board meeting or to your supervisor and you say, I attended a webinar about civic engagement, and they say, well, what's civic engagement? How would you define it at this point in time? Lewis says, starting a conversation about issues within the community. Very good. Anybody else? What's your definition of civic engagement, or just what do you think of when you hear that term? Engaging with the public on political or other issues. I'm glad you added that or other issues, Mary, because I think a lot of times we do tend to think it's more of a political thing, and consequently we shy away from it. So it's not just political. Julia, an open arena for all ideas. Kind of like open access, right? This freedom of access to information. Being involved in the community. Engaging the community on issues important to and affecting the community. Yeah, you're all on the right track. I think one of the easiest ways to define it is to begin by saying what it's not. And I found this quote from a University of Wisconsin report, came out this year actually. And what it's not, it's neither pro-right nor pro-left on the political spectrum. It is pro-democracy. And by democracy, we're talking about how our government is by the people, and that power is vested in the people. There was another definition. This one writer says, it is a complex construct with varying shades of meaning and motivations to take action. I like what a couple of researchers by the name of Adler and Goggins said. This was back in 2005, so this term has been around for a while. They said that civic engagement may involve the possibility of one or more of the following: collective actions, and that is how an individual participates with others to influence civil society; It can involve community service, that is participation in voluntary service to one's community. And I think that's a key component of what we're trying to achieve, getting people to be more involved in their volunteer willingness to serve in their communities. And then finally, political involvement, such as an individual solving problems collectively through political processes. I really like this as a working definition, this coming again from those two researchers I just quoted, Adler and Goggin. And they say that civic engagement is how an active citizen participates in the life of a community in order to improve conditions for others or to help shape the community's future. And I highlighted a few words here. You look at these words, they're active, they participate, they improve, and they shape. What library would not be proud to be a catalyst for that kind of community? To me, this just shouts being vital and being relevant. When I facilitate strategic planning sessions, I advise library boards and staff that they've got to make their library relevant to the community. I've been telling them for a long time that if they want to be relevant, they've got to go beyond thinking that they are simply a repository for books. Now, don't get me wrong, I am a proponent of reading and traditional library services, but our libraries need to expand and become bigger players in our communities. And this quote kind of summarizes all of this from a research article titled "The Digital Library is Place." And you may have already read this, but it's saying that the storage space for materials in the library will become decreasingly important. And the role of the library as a space for users, for individual and collaborative work, and as a space for social activity will become increasingly important. Now, interestingly enough, although I told you that this term civic engagement is kind of a newer buzzword in library land, it's not a new term. Those researchers I quoted in the last slide were from 2005, and nor is the concept of making the library something way beyond a book depository a new concept. And in fact, when I started library school in 2006, one of the first books I read was this one, titled Civic Librarianship, Renewing the Social Mission of the Public Library. It's basically all about civic engagement, and we do have this book in the State Library collection, or at least we did when I last checked. I don't think we've since weeded it. This book was published in 2001, and it defines civic librarianship like this. Civic librarianship seeks to strengthen communities through developmental strategies that renew the public library's mission of education for a democratic society. So it goes on to say that it reaffirms traditional professional values by using new strategies that address the needs of contemporary society. So I want this to be your takeaway from today's presentation, that civic engagement, while it is a newer word and area of development, it's actually an aspect of our traditional professional library values. And those values include access for all. Julie, you kind of mentioned that in the chat just a moment ago. And another of those values is education for a democratic society. There is an interesting report that was issued from the University of Wisconsin from their information schools, technology and social change group. And they asked this question: what role should public libraries play in civic engagement? And this report notes that public libraries need to approach civic engagement differently depending on their location, resources, and community expectations. So realize that fact, that civic engagement is going to be something that you're going to kind of tailor for your library's location, your resources, and your community expectations. But that report goes on to suggest that possible actions for those that are ready to embrace a larger role would include these, and that is supporting diversity among staff, collaborating with civic organizations, sharing their successes with other libraries, and modifying the academic and professional development curricula for libraries. So how many of you already collaborate with civic organizations in your community? And how many of you routinely share your successes with other libraries, maybe in a county meeting or on Library Talk? And I know I do see from time to time on Library Talk, you'll say, hey, I just did this neat idea, this great program, this wonderful event. And that's great. And that's all part of developing this mentality toward being more civic-minded, more civically engaged. I've actually already quoted from this report a few times. This was a study published in 2012. It's a very readable, fairly short research paper from a professor of library science at Pratt Institute. The reason I chose to focus on it here is because it shows, I think, quite well how and why libraries can be ideal places for civic engagement. And it also shows that it doesn't require a lot of change, expense, or specialization. So this study partnered public libraries with PBS's POV, which is their point of view documentary service. And in this study, the public libraries received DVDs, documentary DVDs on a variety of topics, and then communities gathered at those libraries to watch the films and to participate in a delve deeper discussion, which was actually based on a resource kit that was provided for the librarians. So you can see a few more details there on the right. But basically, this study measured the concrete civic actions the attendees were interested in completing after the event. And the study posed the question that you see there on the right. Can libraries act as places for promoting civic engagement through the use of socially and culturally significant documentaries? Now, this is an example, actually from just a year ago, that Chicago Public Library did, where they highlighted one of these POV documentaries, and you can see where the arrow is. This was the basic question that they used as a conversation starter, this civic discourse, the dialogue aspects that would have been discussed during the community engagement program. I have to say, though, that I'm not sure that this POV partnership still exists. I'm a little iffy on that, but there are certainly plenty of ways to incorporate film showings with community dialogue. And as I said, the reason I'm focusing on this so much is because I think it's a fairly easy way for libraries to develop some civic engagement. This is a personal example, a library program that used to take place at a library where I formerly worked. We were members of the Film Movement Club, and you can see the URL there. And I did check, the Film Movement Club still exists. Basically, every month we got this film that we were able to show before it was released to theaters, and we showed it in partnership with the Tri-State Cinema Society, an organization that already existed in this community. And they led thought-provoking discussion afterwards. So this is the kind of program that can be done by any size library. And the costs for this particular Film Movement Club, it's pretty nominal. So going back to that research paper about the documentary film program, the researcher concluded that the survey results indicate that a clear outcome of the film screening and discussion is a greater understanding of the issues presented in that film. Let's hear that again. The attendees had a greater understanding of the issues presented in the film. For many patrons, developing a knowledge base around the issues raised in the program is a necessary first step before taking more intensive actions. And I want you to keep that thought in mind because we'll return to it in an upcoming slide. Basically speaking, following these screenings and discussions at the library, participants moderately to strongly agreed to take some kind of civic action, either to donate money to an organization working on those issues or to join an organization working on the issues, etc. So according to this study, film screenings also have added benefits for libraries more generally, such as, you see on the slide here, elevating the profile of the library within the community and attracting new patrons. So I think these are benefits well worth considering, kind of side benefits, aside from the ones of getting people more civically involved in your community. It's helping your library as well. So why are libraries ideal places for civic engagement? Well, aside from the fact that libraries have already proven themselves effective in doing this, the Urban Libraries Council published a report on civic engagement in which they cite public libraries are trusted and tested resources that aren't going away. They have deep hometown roots and broad assets that contribute to community building. And some of you may remember hearing about this Pew Internet Report from 2016, which showed, now this is debatable, it's 40% of US adults trust information. That doesn't sound like a lot, that's what I mean by debatable, but when you look at it in comparison with the others, that trust factor from public libraries is a lot compared to how the public trusts other organizations. So in general, the public already trusts libraries as a resource for information. Many of you probably saw this. Mandy shared this just the other day on Library Talk. This is an op piece from the Washington Post. It came out on September 18th. And the author is encouraging people to go to your public library. It's the place where you can go to get the truth. And the writer goes on to say, public libraries provide information in an era of misinformation. They offer facts and nuance. They offer the opportunity for enlightenment. They offer every visitor the resources they need to find answers. This article quotes the author of a new book titled Palaces for the People, who describes libraries as the textbook example of social infrastructure in action, and that libraries are the place that bring people together. So some things to think about there. This comes from the Urban Libraries Council from a webinar that they did titled, as you see here on the slide. You can actually do an online search for this title and probably come up with the webinar yourself too and watch it. But as you see here on the slide, they talked about the reasons for libraries to promote civic engagement, and the reasons are quite powerful. It's encouraging people to contribute to their communities in meaningful, productive, sustained ways. It's creating that environment where everybody has a voice and a valued place. It builds capacity to take on challenging issues. So oftentimes libraries will do community engagement, civic engagement activities where they're trying to solve a more local issue. And it also strengthens democracy and builds strong communities. Now, these sound like very lofty ideals, but as we've seen from some of the research, it's possible. I heard in that webinar one of the consultants from Urban Libraries Council say this, that civic engagement is an essential component of what libraries do. It's kind of why they exist. She commented that we need to make civic engagement an explicit commitment instead of an implicit fact of what the library is. And I think that's pretty good, something to think about. One of the most convincing arguments as to why libraries should become more active in civic engagement is because the evidence overwhelmingly points to the fact that these activities raise the library's value and relevance. And again, quoting from Urban Libraries Council, they say that the more attached, or civic engagement actually helps people feel connected to their communities, and the more attached people are to the communities, the more empowered they feel to voice their perspectives. And that's a good thing, because not only because of this reason, that community attachment may be the leading indicator of economic vitality, but also because communities where people are civically engaged are more economic resilient. So basically, what that report is saying is that there is a direct correlation between high levels of civic engagement and economic growth. And I know that whenever I conduct strategic planning sessions at libraries, the big thing that everybody wants for their community is more economic growth. So civic engagement activities can help lead to economic growth. That's quite an assessment, I think. This slide is from an event I just attended this week. This is one of the community conversations. There have been several that have taken place throughout the entire state. And this was all about community conversations, civil discourse, civic engagement. The terms kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes you might hear it known as dialogue and discourse as well. So I think all of those terms can be interchangeable. You might hear it as many different aspects. But the neat thing about this community conversations, because oftentimes when we talk about civic engagement, we think, oh, it's got to lead to some kind of a change. We got to change things. We got to make it so everybody's going to vote this way or think this way or lead to this action. And according to what this presenter said, that's not what our goal is. We have to first think about mindset. If you look at this pyramid, at the very top is where change occurs. And that change cannot occur until we do these steps below the pyramid, which take more time. Those are the broader sections of the pyramid. And we start with mindset. And then we start with building relationships, and then we move a little up to listening and learning. So let me just kind of mention what I have here in my notes. I can do that better than trying to tell you myself here. It says, we need to work a lot more on foundational aspects such as mindset, which in our early examples would be sharing the films and information of the library. And we need to spend more time on building relationships, both with community partners and among our own residents. Our libraries can promote opportunities to listen and learn, and that's where the library's hosting of civic engagement or conversation starters or whatever you want to call them can come into play. So we're not going to delve a whole lot more into this concept today. We'll save that for next year's development of our continuing ed opportunities. But keep in mind that your library doesn't have to reach that top point of the pyramid. Your library should simply work on those foundational aspects, and by doing so, it's much more likely that your residents and communities will climb to the top of the pyramid. So if you remember a few slides ago, I quoted from the research paper about the POV film series, and I said developing a knowledge base around the issues raised in the program is a necessary first step before taking more intensive actions. That's exactly what this pyramid is reflecting. Mindset, listening and learning, those are early steps that any size library can help provide to their community through civic engagement activities.
Cynthia from Cresco did sort of ask a larger question about if this provides an opportunity to provide a one-sided agenda to some groups.
I would say no, because you're asking open-ended questions, and a lot of what many of these concepts and programs do, and we'll probably delve more into those next year as we develop our training, but what they do is give you a chance to understand. It's that building relationships. There was a really neat video that was shared at this session that you see here on the slide, the one that I recently attended over at Drake University. It was about two highly unlikely people from completely opposite spectrums, politically, spiritually, you name it, ethically. They were just completely opposites. And one of them reached out to the other and said, I would like to have coffee with you. I just want to get to know you. And from that, they learned that they actually liked each other. And as they said, they formerly kind of viewed each other as the enemy. And their opinions didn't change about the issues, but they learned to respect each other as people and to kind of rethink how they present their positions. It was just a very, very enlightening moment. And I kind of summarized it to a friend who wasn't able to go. I said, basically what this community conversation does is it gets you to see people as people instead of just as a label of some kind of social or racial or religious label. And when you have those relationships built, I think it's much easier to move forward together to get to the top of that pyramid. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay, I'm going to hand things over to Mandy now, and she's going to share ways with you that you can use your library's meeting space to promote civic engagement activities. So Mandy, I'll hand it off to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. A public library is not required to have a meeting room. And even if a library has a meeting room, it's not required to make that room available for the public to use. Some libraries' meeting rooms are for staff and library-initiated program purposes only. But if a library does invite the community to use library spaces, it takes on the responsibility to uphold First Amendment rights of free expression. Access to these spaces should conform to the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights, a document of professional ethics that complies with the legal requirements of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Libraries maintaining meeting room facilities should develop and publish policy statements governing use. These statements can properly define time, place, or manner of use, but such qualifications should not pertain to the content of a meeting or to the beliefs or affiliations of the sponsors. These statements should be made available in any commonly used language within the community served. If meeting rooms are made available to the general public, the library may not exclude any group based on the subject matter to be discussed or based on the ideas that the group advocates. For example, if a library allows charities and sports clubs to discuss their activities in the meeting room, then the library should not exclude partisan, political, or religious groups from discussing their activities in the same facility. The library should post a permanent notice near the meeting room stating that the library does not advocate or endorse the viewpoints of meetings or meeting room users. Written policies for meeting room use should be stated in inclusive rather than exclusive terms. For example, a policy that the library's room is open to organizations engaged in educational, cultural, intellectual, or charitable activities is an inclusive statement of the limited uses to which the facility may be put. This defined limitation would permit religious groups to use the facility because they engage in intellectual activities, but the policy would exclude most commercial uses of the room. Policies may include limitations on the frequency of use and whether or not meetings must be open to the public. There is no state law in Iowa regulating whether or not gatherings held in library meeting rooms must be open to the general public. The decision is up to local library boards. Most libraries allow both private and public meetings in their facilities. If meetings are open to the public, libraries should include in their meeting room policies a section that addresses admission fees. If admission fees are permitted, libraries should ensure that these fees do not limit access to individuals who are unable to pay but still wish to attend the meetings. Article 5 of the Library Bill of Rights states that, quote, "A person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views," unquote. It's inconsistent with Article 5 to indirectly restrict access to meeting rooms based on an individual's or group's ability to pay for that access. Most libraries avoid this situation by prohibiting admission fees at meetings in their facilities. However, libraries that charge for access to their meeting rooms need to have a system in place by which those charges can be waived if an individual or group cannot pay the required access fee. The best way to ensure equitable access to the library's services is to offer them for free because technically taxpayers have already been assessed for them. Let's first address political events in the library. During every election cycle, political campaigns, parties, and candidates ask to use the library for forums, debates, meet and greet events, and even caucuses. It's important for library directors and boards of trustees to be aware of the many state laws and regulations regarding such use of city property. Iowa Code Chapter 68A is entitled Campaign Finance. Section 68A.505 is entitled Use of Public Monies for Political Purposes and says in part that government, and that covers city agencies, shall not permit the expenditure of public monies for political purposes, including expressly advocating for the passage or defeat of a ballot issue. Iowa Administrative Code, Title 351, contains the rules by which the Iowa Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board operates to monitor and enforce compliance with the laws pertaining to state, county, and city political campaigns. Chapter 5 is entitled Use of Public Resources for a Political Purpose and contains the rules and regulations that implement Iowa Code Section 68A.505. Holding a political function for a particular candidate is a prohibited political activity on government property. However, under the exceptions to the law in Rule 5.5, such functions can be held in libraries' meeting rooms because it's available to the general public to use for other purposes. In this case, the other purpose is a political event that will take place within the confines of that room. It cannot spill out into the library proper. Libraries can charge candidates or campaigns for the use of their meeting rooms if other persons or groups must also rent the meeting rooms. If the meeting room is available to the general public for, say, $25 and requires a $50 deposit, then candidates and campaigns must pay the same rate. If the meeting room is available on a first-come, first-served basis, then candidates can reserve the room if they follow the normal reservation rules. If the meeting room is already booked for the date and time a political campaign or candidate wants it, then it's unavailable.
Well, since we're focusing on civic engagement, and since part of civic engagement includes informing people and trying to get them to participate in democracy, can the library host a candidate forum or a debate among the candidates that might be running for office?
The Iowa Administrative Code explicitly allows libraries to host candidate debates or forums as long as at least 2 candidates seeking the same office are invited to attend the event. The rule also allows the distribution of campaign materials on governmental property during the forum or debate. While many libraries host or even coordinate such forums in order to promote upcoming elections and encourage discussion in their communities, partisan events for candidates are different matters. Each city and library board must determine what it's comfortable allowing. Many cities take the approach that candidates are the same as any other members of the public and may use the city's meeting rooms if they follow the same rules that apply to ordinary citizens. On its website, the Iowa Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board posted a formal legal interpretation of the Iowa Administrative Code's rules on the use of public resources or property for political purposes. Under the heading, Examples of Prohibited Uses of Public Funds, number 6 reads, governmental bodies are prohibited from displaying political posters, brochures, flyers, or promotional literature of any type. Most public library meeting room policies already prohibit any signs on library property that announce the subject matter of meetings being held in their meeting rooms, because signs can lead the public to believe that the library is somehow sponsoring or endorsing the meetings. Even when meeting announcements are posted in other areas of the community or communicated on mass media, library policy typically mandates that the library's name remains completely disassociated from any part of the meeting's content, and in fact, insists that the library is mentioned only as the location for the meeting room, not the meeting, but the meeting room. In the case of a political event, it's especially important to be vigilant about this policy. Be certain that all related advertisements are carefully crafted so that the library does not appear to be sponsoring or endorsing a partisan political event.
And I saw in the chat that somebody had an organization distribute their flyers throughout the library without the library's knowledge. That's certainly not allowable in any of these circumstances. And I would just say that obviously you collected those flyers, but I would probably contact that organization and let them know what happened and that that is a violation of policy. It's quite possible the organization itself didn't do that, but just some rogue member or person that they would take it upon themselves to share that information. But yeah, hopefully you got that situation taken care of. So Mandy, what about caucuses? Can the library serve as a caucus location?
Regarding caucuses in libraries, Iowa Code Section 43.93 says, each precinct caucus shall be held in a building which is publicly owned or is suitable for and from time to time made available for holding public meetings wherever it's possible to do so. Upon the application of the county chairperson, the person having control of a building supported by taxation shall make available the space necessary to conduct the caucus without charge during presidential election years and at a charge not greater than that made for its use by other groups during other years. So to repeat, you can charge meeting room fees to caucus groups in non-presidential election years, such as this one, 2018, and those fees can't be higher than what you charge other groups. But you cannot charge caucus groups fees during presidential election years, such as 2020. The Secretary of State's office advises libraries to attempt to accommodate their local political parties on caucus nights, and especially caucus nights during presidential election cycles. If the library is not scheduled to be open that evening, you'll have to open for the caucus. While there's no law that says public buildings must be staffed during caucuses, the Secretary of State says that of course the library should be staffed. It's completely unfair to the political party to make them liable for anything that might happen while they're alone in the building, and it's unfair to taxpayers to leave their property unguarded. The library cannot charge the party for any costs associated with hosting the caucus, the staff, the cleanup, the extra toilet paper, etc. If a library doesn't have a meeting room, the Secretary of State says the library should negotiate with the party and explain that their meeting would be out in the open for everyone to hear and see. That is, if the library is normally open during those hours. And so it would be better to hold the caucus somewhere more conducive to privacy. However, if the caucus planners insist, the Secretary says the library should allow the caucus to take place in the library proper.
So what if a candidate for public office wants to attend a library board meeting just to introduce himself or herself and to speak about library issues?
In order for anyone to speak at a library board meeting, there has to be an agenda item that allows it. It's typically called a public forum. The Iowa Library Trustees Handbook on page 11 says, have a clear policy about regulating the activity of people who attend your board meetings. If you have a public forum section of the agenda, keep in mind it's a time for listening, not uncontrolled debate. Set a time limit for the open forum and explain the rules for those who want to speak. In your policy, state that the board will only listen and will not respond to those who speak during the open forum. If a response is needed, it should come at a later time when the entire board has had time to deliberate the issue, to seek more information, or to take recommendations from the director. The handbook also says, understand that your board meeting is a meeting conducted in public, not a public meeting. In other words, the public and media representatives are there to watch the board work, not participate in the board meeting. According to a couple of advisory opinions published on the website for the Iowa Ethics and Campaign Disclosure Board, as long as the candidate addressing the board doesn't expressly advocate for the passage or defeat of a ballot issue, such as her own election, then she's not in violation of the law prohibiting the use of public resources for political purposes.
And what if a group working to elect a particular candidate wants to reserve the meeting room to set up a phone bank to solicit campaign volunteers and donation pledges?
Your meeting room policy probably states that organizations using the room are prohibited from affiliating themselves with the city, and specifically the library, and that the library does not endorse the views of any group using the meeting room. Of course, the group could not use the library's telephone system or identify themselves as calling from the public library, but otherwise what they're doing is a legal use of your meeting room.
And I imagine that although it is legal, a big consideration for this type of request might be whether or not the library's meeting space has enough outlets or whether the bandwidth can accommodate a lot of laptops operating simultaneously. So just some things to consider and for you to warn any groups that may make this kind of request. A library where I formerly worked routinely hosted an event called Meet Your Legislators. They did this at the library. It started out fairly small, but it has grown. They're still doing it. It's been many years that they've done this. It's grown to be a standing room only event. It's always held on a Saturday. It's standing room only. And I have this little flyer up. This was from their 2018 events, but notice these partnerships. It's the Teachers Association, the library, the League of Women Voters, a variety of Teamster unions, the United Neighborhoods of the city, and Valley Watch. Plus, if you see there under the dates, the local public station, their local PBS, live streams the event on their station. So it's become a pretty big event. Right here in Iowa, there is a similar example. This is Coffee with the Council. Your city council members, bring them in on occasion and throw out some coffee and some donuts and allow the public to come in and ask questions and meet with them. That can be a great activity to do. There's a similar program. This one is from a branch location of the Madison Public Library in Wisconsin. And it says, coffee and conversation with your neighbors and community service providers. I'm not sure what they mean by community service providers. I think that could take several roads, like police or fire, public works, local hospital. But I like how they say conversation with your neighbors, because that's what civic engagement is all about. Let's shift our focus from politics and move on to another touchy topic, and that's religion. What about religion in the library?
Well, the library is supposed to be a religiously neutral place, right? The courts have consistently held that for the freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment to be fully meaningful, people must have the right to receive information, that is, to read, view, hear, or access what they choose. In addition, the First Amendment guarantees the right of individuals to believe and practice their religion, or to practice no religion at all, and prohibits government from establishing or endorsing a religion or religions. In most cases involving religion and libraries, these freedoms are not the issue. Rather, the constitutional principles at stake are usually freedom of expression and the corollary freedom to access the expression of others. For libraries' purposes, religion refers to all that touches on the infinite, a supreme deity or deities, or one's understanding of the ultimate meaning or purposes of life. It includes formal, organized systems of belief and practice, and informal, individual spiritualities. It also refers to adherents of older religions, newer religions, and no religion. Courts have consistently held that libraries may not exclude religious groups from their meeting rooms solely because the group is religious in character or because the meeting may include religious activities. Courts have consistently held that libraries are limited public forums for the receipt of information. In turn, libraries may designate areas within their facilities as limited public forums for use by the community for the exchange of information and may create rules for their use. No court has ever ruled that a library must exclude religious groups. The safest course of action is to provide the same access and apply the same rules of use to all community groups.
Can a religious group collect an offering, like really hold a worship service and collect an offering in the meeting room? And what about any sacramental food and beverages, for example, wine, that many religious groups use?
The same policies regarding money should apply to all groups. If nonprofit groups are allowed to collect membership dues during meetings, then religious groups may collect an offering. If no group may collect money for any purpose while using a library meeting room, then collecting an offering should not be permitted. Regarding sacramental food and wine, again, the same policies about food and beverages should apply to all groups. If alcohol is not permitted for any group, then the use of sacramental wine would not be allowed. However, it would be wise to avoid rules that, even though unintentional, privilege one religion over another. For instance, the Catholic Mass and the Jewish Seder include the use of wine, while many but not all Protestant groups use grape juice in their observance of the Eucharist. Should hymn singing be allowed? All groups should be subject to the same policies regarding noise. For instance, if a meeting room were soundproofed, there'd be no reason to prohibit hymns or, for that matter, a workshop for local heavy metal bands' drummers. In 2010, the Alliance Defense Fund, a Christian legal organization, initiated a letter writing campaign to libraries and schools around the country with meeting room policies that restricted their use for religious services. The organization declared such policies unconstitutional and threatened lawsuits. In late 2010 and early 2011, most of those libraries had changed their meeting room policies to include gatherings of religious and political groups on the advice of the attorneys at the American Library Association and the library's own city attorneys.
So Mandy was predominantly addressing groups that would want to use your meeting space to hold a religious service, but in the context of civic engagement and having community discourse, this is a poster from an event that I conducted at a library where I formerly worked, and I didn't mention it earlier because it kind of fits in with this topic about religion. It shows that it is possible to have civic engagement on this topic. This program, as you can see on the poster, was aimed at teens because I was the teen specialist librarian at the time, but I also had some adults attend as well. This event featured a Jewish rabbi, a local Muslim imam, a person who represented the local Hindu temple, an individual who was a practicing Buddhist, a Protestant pastor, and a Catholic priest. And as I said in my proposal for this program, the purpose of the program was to provide a general idea of the basic tenets of these religions, ways that they are similar and ways that they're different. And I also hope that attendees would walk away with a better understanding of, as you can see on the poster, the significant contributions that various religions have made to society and the ways that religion affects personal, historical, political, geographical, cultural, and many other aspects of life. So the way this program was set up, I had quite a panel, as you heard, and each of the presenters had a table with information, and attendees could browse those tables before and after the presentation and ask individual questions. But at the actual presentation, each panelist had about 12 to 15 minutes to present the basics of his or her faith. And I had questions already prepared that I had asked each of them to do in advance, and they were kind of general aspects. What's the name of your deity, and what are the special characteristics? How did your religion begin? What special ceremonies are there pertaining to birth or coming of age, etc.? What are the special laws and codes of ethics? What are your afterlife beliefs? What requirements or expectations are there for participation in this religion? So again, this is the kind of program that can be done in any size library, and you wouldn't have to do it all in one program. You could make it a monthly event and focus on a different religion with a different presenter at each of those sessions. But the good thing about having all the representatives in the room at the same time was that it really did encourage dialogue. And although I didn't have a huge audience, it was a moderate-sized audience, but those who attended it really appreciated. And one of the presenters wrote an article for the newspaper's religion section as follow-up, and this is what she said. I learned all kinds of things. Peace is at the heart of each tradition. Could these really be the same religions for which people kill one another every day? I was moved as I listened to what each one holds dear. I couldn't help but wonder how hard it could really be to respect one another. And that's kind of what community engagement, civil discourse is all about, learning how to respect each other. So. As we noted earlier, Mandy, a lot of the civic engagement discussion forums and topics and options can include these kind of touchy topics that are apt to have strong opinions among individuals, things like abortion or reproductive rights, immigration. So what information do you have to share with us regarding best practices for those kinds of topics?
Controversial programming in the library, whether it's sponsored by the library itself or by an outside group, can serve a purpose in the library. It'd likely be easier to avoid community discussions and programming on divisive topics, such as LGBTQ issues, women's reproductive freedoms, federal immigration policies, and other hot-button issues, but programs support the mission of the library by providing users with additional opportunities for accessing information, education, and recreation. They're designed for the interests and enlightenment of all people in the community the library serves. Library-initiated programs introduce users and potential users to library resources and the library's role as a facilitator of information access. The library can participate in cooperative or joint programs with other agencies, organizations, institutions, or individuals to facilitate informational programs. Such programs include lectures, community forums, performances and visual arts, participatory workshops, technology programming, creative learning programming, wellness programs, story times, continuing education, fairs and conventions, book clubs, discussion groups, demonstrations, displays, and presentations for social, cultural, educational, or entertainment purposes. They can take place on-site at the library, off-site in other locations, or online, and may be delivered by library staff, library volunteers, or library partners. As stated in ALA's interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights entitled Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, socially excluded, marginalized, and underrepresented people, not just the mainstream majority, should be able to see themselves reflected in the resources and programs that libraries offer. Libraries should actively seek to include a variety of programming options representing a diversity of ideas with a multitude of viewpoints and cultural perspectives that reflect the diversity in our communities, our state, our nation, and the world. Library-initiated programs that cross language and cultural barriers introduce underserved populations to the library's resources and provide access to information. Libraries serving multilingual or multicultural communities should make efforts to accommodate the information needs of those who speak and read languages other than English.
We had a comment, I noticed a couple of them. Somebody said there is a difference between having a religious service in the library's meeting room and doing a program about religion, and that's true. I think that doing the program about religion help develop a better understanding so that if and when one of those religious groups might need to use the library's meeting room for a service, there might be a better understanding and less of an outcry by people who might find that, oh, you're not supposed to be doing that. You now have the tools, thanks to Mandy, you have the information to know what you can and can't do. And then someone else asked about the coffee conversation things with legislators, and Mandy, this would probably be one, if we don't have the answer, that the Iowa Public Information Board could ask. She asked, what about a quorum? If you get your council members there and all of them are there, you've got a quorum, how do you differentiate that from a meeting? And I would say that you would publicize it in advance and they would not be taking action at that coffee.
Right, that's what distinguishes a meeting.
Right.
And that's in some of the ephemeral material that's connected to, like if you go to the Iowa Information Board's, Iowa Public Information Board's website, they do define what creates a meeting and what's not a meeting. And this would be called a social event because they're not going to talk about city business. They're not going to vote on things. You know, they're not going to advance some sort of agenda. They're just talking about
just answering questions from the public.
Exactly.
Yeah. And this may or may not qualify as a hot button topic in your community, but where I formerly lived, there was an ever-growing Hispanic population, and the library was trying to serve the needs of that group. It wasn't entirely sure what to do and with whom to partner. We knew there were several other organizations in town that were trying to do the same thing, but we really didn't know all of them or what exactly any of them were doing. So I thought I would do a one-time program for a meeting of the minds and just get all of those organizations together to figure out who was doing what and what needs were still being unmet. Well, it turned out that this one-time meeting, the attendees, there were a lot of people who attended and they loved the concept and they wanted to meet monthly. So we started meeting monthly, and a lot of partnerships developed between the various groups, and several of them partnered with the library. And one of the neatest partnerships, it was an offshoot from the local university. They were conducting English language classes for new immigrants, and they needed a place where they could set up computers, and they were hoping to find a fairly neutral location, and so far they had only been able to find churches, and they feared that some of the churches, depending on the denomination, might have been a turnoff for potential attendees. So I told them, well, we've got this tech lab here at the library. I can reserve it for you on a monthly basis. And so the head of this program started bringing the classes to the library using the tech lab, and as part of the classes allowed us, the library, to give tours of the library and help the class attendees to get library cards. This was something we had not been able to do ourselves. We had a lot of trouble getting the Hispanic population into the library. So this got them into the library. It showed them what our services were, showed them that we had resources in their language, gave them a library card. It was just absolutely a win-win situation, not only for both of the organizations, but for the people we were trying to serve. So that's kind of a civic engagement partnership idea there. Mandy, I know that some libraries will deny checkouts or even computer usage to patrons who have high fines, and I don't think I've heard of any libraries denying program attendance for that reason, but I have heard of libraries occasionally charging for materials for programs, and you kind of mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but what's your take on that?
Libraries should not deny access to library-initiated programs to patrons who owe the library for overdue fines or other fees, nor should program attendees be required to share their personal information in order to attend a library program. Any collection of program participants' personal information should be on an opt-in basis only. If libraries charge program participants for supplies used, they should make every effort to reduce economic barriers to participation. Libraries should have a policy guiding the development and implementation of programs, similar to material selection and building use policies, which has been approved by the board after consultation with the city attorney. These guidelines should set forth the library's commitment to free and open access to information and ideas for all users. The policy should outline the mission of the library, how speakers are chosen, the scope of the programs offered, how facilities are used, how programs will be advertised and by whom, and potential security needs. The policy should also refer to the library's code of conduct and expectations for customer behaviors during library-initiated and hosted events. Libraries should be receptive to community suggestions for programs, events, and speakers. Libraries use a variety of criteria to select speakers. Common criteria include current topics of interest and the information needs of the community. The availability of resources to present programs and speakers is also a factor. Library-sponsored speakers should have some expertise, credentials, or credibility on the topics they're discussing.
You can see on this slide that a very basic online search for public library programming policy will generate quite a few examples for you if your library is in need of this kind of a policy.
Article 2 of the Library Bill of Rights states, materials should not be proscribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. Likewise, programs should not be canceled because of the ideas or topics of the program or the views expressed by participants or speakers. Library sponsorship of a program does not constitute an endorsement of the program content or the views expressed by the participants or speakers, any more than the purchase of materials for the library's collection constitutes an endorsement of the material's content or its creator's views. Libraries should vigorously defend the First Amendment right of speakers and participants to express themselves. Concerns, questions, or complaints about library-initiated programs are handled according to the same written policy and procedures that govern reconsiderations of other library resources. I'm sometimes asked if a library has an ethical responsibility to counter questionable viewpoints being expressed in its meeting room. For instance, a group denying human involvement in climate change booked a library's meeting room for a presentation to which the public was invited. The librarian asked if she should do something to educate the public on the more evidence-based scientific perspective of climate change that reaches the opposite conclusion. The answer is that the library is under no obligation to balance an outside group's presentation, nor is staff prohibited from doing so, depending on community interest and relevance. At some point, a library program may cause controversy. Libraries should not shy away from controversy. Staff should be aware of applicable library policies and the criteria for selecting programs and the community's use of library spaces. Staff should be prepared to explain these policies as well as the bedrock principles of intellectual freedom. Cheat sheets prepared ahead of time by the library's administration can help frontline staff under pressure. Complaints should be received respectfully. Many complaints can be resolved with respectful conversations. Every library should have a request for reconsideration policy and follow it. The principles of these policies also apply to programs, events, and speakers. Libraries can modify reconsideration policies so that they apply to programming.
If by some chance your library does not have a reconsideration policy, you can talk with your district consultant. We'll be happy to help you with that. I really hope nobody's staff meetings or public meetings look like this, but we did talk earlier about some programs that are designed to foster civic conversation rather than controversial disruption. But if a library program is controversial, how do you recommend librarians help create a civil environment that fosters respectful conversation?
Generally speaking, conduct or behavior policies apply to all programs and should be provided to attendees ahead of time. As with any event held at the library staff should welcome all visitors and interact with them courteously. Policies and procedures should be transparent, available to all, and equitably enforced. For library-initiated events, a library representative should set the tone at the start of the event to reflect shared values and community spirit and outline clear expectations for frank but respectful dialogue. If people violate acceptable behavior guidelines, they should be asked to stop the behavior or leave the library. If people fail to comply, the library should follow its appropriate behavior policy. There may be a fear that audience members will pose challenging and provocative questions. Such questions are part of civil discourse and free speech. Libraries can limit the amount of time a questioner may speak. However, libraries support the right of individuals to ask uncomfortable questions. If there is concern that provocative questions may distract from the program, alternative Q&A formats may be considered. Some libraries have found success in having audience members submit written questions to be read by a moderator, but libraries should not use this as a method to censor relevant questions.
Is it ever appropriate to cancel or disinvite a speaker?
Basically, cancellation is appropriate only when there's a facility issue or inclement weather. It's not appropriate when the topic is controversial or there have been complaints about the speaker, program, or event. If there is a credible public safety threat, library workers should consult with the city attorney and local law enforcement. Canceling a speaker, program, or event because of real or anticipated controversy could negatively impact the reputation of the library and its ability to serve the community as a forum for the exchange of ideas. There could also be public relations, legal, financial, or other contractual implications.
And what if the library hears that people are upset about a program and plan to organize a protest?
Well, begin by recognizing the concerns people have with the program and take steps to address them with respectful and civil conversations. Staff should follow their reconsideration policy for programs, events, and speakers. Staff should also carefully review any publicity to ensure it describes the event accurately. If a protest is still planned, the library director should determine the maximum occupancy of the building and address any other building safety issues, such as clearing hallways and ensuring access to emergency exits. Ensure that the library's written policies addressing disruptive behavior are in place and handy. At least one senior staff member, preferably the director, should be present at potentially controversial events, and staff coverage of the library may need to be increased. Public libraries are not public squares, and disruptive behaviors can be restricted. Other library users have a right to the quiet use and enjoyment of the library. Library administrators should communicate with the leaders of the protest groups and maintain an open line of communication with them. Ask group leaders to establish a tone of respect and civil discourse during the program. Inform them that libraries are not required to allow protesters inside the library. People have a constitutional right to protest on the public sidewalk and other public spaces not controlled by the library. Remind group leaders to consult with the city clerk regarding permits for organized demonstrations. Consult with law enforcement. If there is any sign that groups will clash, the library director should request local law enforcement's presence and support. It's not the library's responsibility to supervise or control the behavior of protesters on spaces that are considered traditional public forums. There's no legal requirement to interact with protesters. If protesters impede access to the library, local law enforcement should be called. Safety is paramount. So long as protesters are engaged in peaceful protest on a public sidewalk and not impeding access to the library, they're entitled to exercise their First Amendment right to free speech. The staff at the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom is available to answer questions or provide assistance to librarians, trustees, and the public. Areas of assistance include policy development, First Amendment issues, and professional ethics. You can direct concerns to the contacts on the slide.
All right, and I saw that we did have some questions come in and some conversation about computer use, and I think Alicia is keeping track of that we will address those in just a moment. I just want to say that we tried to cover a lot of topics here that are the what if questions that so many librarians ask us. So I want to say that many libraries are hosting a lot of civic engagement, community conversation, civil discourse programs on a variety of topics, and they're not having protests and they're not having brawls in the library. So I don't want you to shy away from these things, but you are well prepared with the information that Mandy has shared. So with that in mind, I just want to share a few additional resources that are available and some ideas to spark some very easy ways that you can promote more civic engagement at your library. And thank you, Mandy, for all of the work that you did, the research and the information you shared. This is, I think, a really inspiring program, and it's very similar to our All Iowa Reads program, which I know a lot of you are already hosting and promoting at your libraries. This is a program called Book to Action. It's a California-based program that started in 2011, and it offers grants to California libraries to host these types of events. So you're probably going, well, what's that got to do with us here in Iowa? Well, I'm sharing it because there are good ideas for programs on this Book to Action website. There are some wonderful bibliographies of recommended titles that naturally work for this type of a discussion, a community program. So basically the Book to Action program is a book discussion with a purpose. It's very much like many of our community-wide book groups, but the purpose is not just on getting everybody to read the same book, but on reading the same book and sharing ideas on the theme or the topic of that book and possibly changing the community or getting people more involved in the community. So as a couple of examples, one book was about foster kids, and it led to a partnership with the foster program and more people becoming interested in serving as foster parents. Another one dealt with urban farming, and it led to the transformation of some abandoned property to become a community garden. So it's just a really neat way to get people more involved in their communities. According to one of the speakers about this Book to Action program, she said she can hardly keep up with the interest. It was acknowledged that many of the titles used are nonfiction, but documentaries can tie in well. And in fact, the book that I mentioned on the topic about foster kids was actually fiction. There is a currently available archived webinar about the Book to Action program. It's sponsored by InfoPeople. It's a very good presentation. You can see the URL to the class down there at the bottom of the slide, or you can just do an online search for the presentation title, Book to Action, Putting Words into Action. This is interesting. This email popped up just a week or so ago, tied in perfectly with today's discussion. It's from the National Issues Forum, and the topic is about driverless vehicles. What priorities should be at the top of our list? So in case you're not familiar with National Issues Forums, here's some information about who they are and what they do. Their mission is to promote the use of public deliberation in a variety of settings throughout the United States. And their guides are, they give you these guides, these questions and thought-provoking discussion kinds of things. And you can see in the photo there, it's just people sitting around having a conversation. But their guides are designed to stimulate public deliberation, which is a way of making decisions together that is different from discussion or debate. The purpose of deliberative forums is to inform collective action, and I'm reading from their website here. As citizens, we have to make decisions together before we can act together, whether with other citizens or through legislative bodies. Acting together is essential for addressing problems that can't be solved by one group of people or one institution. These problems have more than one cause and therefore have to be met by a number of mutually reinforcing initiatives with public participation. So they include these thought discussions, these 3 options for deliberation that you can see here on the slide. There are very nominal fees for their resources, for their guides and such that can be purchased for use and assistance with their deliberations. Here is another one, Conversation Cafe. I think it was the Public Library Association that used this as part of deliberative dialogue, civic engagement, community conversations. As I said, you can kind of use all of those terms interchangeably in this thought process. But according to Conversation Cafe, there's nothing to join, no homework, no agenda, just a simple process that helps to shift us from small talk to big talk, conversations that matter. And the website explains it is a 1.5 hour hosted conversation held in a public setting like a cafe or a library, where anyone is welcome to join. A simple format helps people feel at ease and gives everyone who wants it a chance to speak. It's also fine for people to simply listen. There's a lot of information available as resources for hosts, also known as librarians, to access from the Conversation Cafe website. ALA's Programming Librarian has a lot of librarian recommended tips for hosting conversation cafes as well, and those tips include not just the ones you see on the slide here about advanced planning and marketing, but also budget details, and you can see from the screenshot here the budget's noted as between $1 and $50, so it's pretty nominal. Other tips include day of event tips, program execution, and advice. The American Library Association recently, I think earlier this year or toward the end of last year, I don't really remember, but they did a big dialogue and deliberation program webinar push. It was a multi-part webinar, and they had these special sessions designed for various size libraries, and the screenshot that I have here is for public libraries serving small, mid-size, or rural communities. Just keep in mind that most all of our Iowa libraries fall into one of those size descriptions according to ALA definitions. But this webinar is still available. If you go to this URL and scroll down the screen a bit, you'll see that the webinar link is still there, and there's a lot of useful information here. These conversation cafes and other dialogue deliberation possibilities from ALA offer ways for libraries to present the previously mentioned hot button topics in a very civil and educational format. Public Library Association also has an entire page full of resources about civic and community engagement. If you just do an online search for PLA Civic Community Engagement, you should easily find this resource. I didn't put the URL up here because it was quite long. As I hope we've conveyed, providing civic engagement opportunities at your library should be a natural part of what your public library is. It's a wonderful opportunity to bring your community together. It's doable in any size library. It doesn't have to be expensive, and it can be a catalyst for positive change. And hopefully it doesn't have to be scary now that you realize the legalities and the many resources that exist for it. I just want to conclude before we go to question and answer by sharing this quote, which was taken from an OCLC blog. It's quoting the library director at Cornwall. Instead of thinking about the library as the heart of the community, she advocated that the community is the heart of the library, and that's kind of what civic engagement is all about. So I'm going to try to access chat, and Alicia, if you wouldn't mind sharing some past questions with us, that would be nice.
Sure. Well, there was a conversation about using guest passes on computers. There weren't really any questions associated with that, but there was a question, I believe it was Cynthia at Cresco, asking what to do about an individual kind of bullying the library with laws in order to promote a personal agenda. And maybe Cynthia can give us more information about that, but I'm assuming that to mean that, sort of, I don't know, using legal stuff to get his point across.
It kind of makes me think, Mandy, of that question we addressed in the top 10, somebody coming in and deliberately displaying a gun because they just want to be challenged, that they can say, it's my right to carry a gun. That's kind of what I'm thinking of. If you want to address that, Mandy.
Yeah, I'm a little confused about exactly what she's talking about too, because personal agendas are allowed in the meeting room. So I'm not sure what they'd be bullying about, but they can certainly reserve the meeting room to have a meeting to promote their personal agenda, just like anybody else can. Otherwise, if someone tries to bully you with laws, you can certainly pause the conversation, say, let me take some notes, and I'll speak with our city attorney and get back to you.
Mm-hmm. Cynthia, I don't know if that clarifies your question. If not, maybe we need a little more clarification. I see Tanya just asks if it's unacceptable to bar a patron from programs due to fines owed. Would it also be unacceptable to bar a patron from computers for the same reason? I'm confused as to why libraries require a borrower or guest pass at all. Tanya, I know that topic has come up before. It seems that a lot of libraries don't ban people from coming into the library without a library card, but a lot of libraries, in order to get people to pay down their fines, will ban them from using the computers. And I think Mandy has previously addressed this, that this is not a good practice. I don't think ALA condones it either, that it is denying people access to information. As to your second question, Tanya, why do libraries require a borrower or guest pass at all? I think a lot of times it goes back to who's paying for the resources, and I don't know, Mandy, help me out here. I think a lot of times it's that. And if you had damage done to a computer, you could check on who did that. Kind of like why we have people use a library card to check out the book. When it's returned and it's damaged, you know whom to contact as far as that.
Well, the American Library Association has posted the view for some time that, and I know the state library was guilty of this for a while. I worked over, in the law library, and from January through May, of course, we have an unbelievable number of guests, because people coming to the Capitol for the legislative sessions and things, people wanting to get on the computer to check their email because they've traveled from Northwest Iowa to talk to their legislator, things like that. And so when the state library was insisting that every one of those people had to have a library card, it became pretty evident we were just trying to drive up our numbers, as far as how many people we had registered to use the library. It was sort of a blatant, it became obvious to us at that point that that's all we were doing, because these people were using the computers for 5 minutes and we never saw them again. So we had all these, registrations that were never used, and it inflated and ballooned our numbers up, which may have looked good to legislators at the time. I don't know. We were fighting for our lives at one point, but ALA says that the computers are now a source of information, just like the books that you have in the library. Every other resource you have in the library. So they're not just for fun. They're not just to play video games on. That a lot of libraries have actually cut down the number of books they buy. I think all of us no longer buy encyclopedias or dictionaries or anything, because you can, access that easily on the internet. But the computers are just another source of information. So if you cut someone off from using a computer, you might as well tell them they can't pick up a book in the library, or they can't look at any of the resources that you have behind the reference desk, things like that. It's now on an equal basis. Is that your understanding of it, Marianne?
Right, and that's what I said earlier. It's denying access to information.
Right. Which is a constitutional right, and you can get in trouble for that. So
I would say the only time that you might need to consider it, just as you would consider banning someone from using your library for a day or two, is based upon behavior.
Exactly, and that's a whole different issue. Having overdue fines is often not a behavioral issue. It's something different.
Right. Alicia, did we miss any other questions? Or does anyone have another question you'd like to share with us? Has anybody done any types of civic engagement programs, either deliberately saying this is a civic engagement program, or maybe as we were talking today, you realized, oh, the so-and-so program I did 3 months ago really was civic engagement, and I hadn't thought of it that way? I think this might be the explanation about the bullying thing.
It looks like it, yes.
City council member, part of a local watershed movement supported by AmeriCorps. A documentary that was, they were trying to endorse, it was inflammatory toward the cause of climate change. You were concerned that the library would be accused of endorsing the perspective. We came to agreement that the library would only be listed as the meeting space, which is what Mandy said to do. And you found the class to be informative. Good. Glad to hear that. So yeah, Mandy, that just to review, you did mention that if a group is using the meeting room, it's important that they put on their publicity, this is taking place in the meeting room at such and such library at this address. The library should not be front and center as the meeting place, nor should the library be providing the publicity for those unless it is directly a library-sponsored event. Curious about how to practically enforce wording in other organizations' publicity regarding the library as a meeting space. You understand the idea in theory, but can't quite figure out how you would enforce it. Good question, Kristen from Decora.
It's typically in your policies, and you can look up sample wording. I believe ALA has sample wording. You can also Google other public libraries' wording on it. I believe that I actually read it on the website for the Iowa Public Information Board, but some libraries require the organization to give them a copy of any signs they're putting around town, and they make sure that the organization has a copy of the library's policy on using the library as, within their advertisement. And so when you look at that advertisement, you can tell them, well, this is wrong and this is wrong, you can't do that, things like that. Otherwise, you see the advertisements around town typically, and you can call an organization on how they put the library in it.
Another comment here from Michelle. A local person running for political office reserved the meeting room for a meet and greet, created a Facebook event, and listed the library as co-host. Oh boy. We messaged her to remove us as a host and told her that she could list the meeting room as the location, but that the library was in no way hosting or endorsing her. Thankfully, she complied with your request for her. That's good. And Dorothy, you're welcome. We're glad you found it beneficial today.